The golden lights of the Christmas tree blurred into halos of color through my swollen eye. Each blink sent a fresh wave of pain radiating across my cheekbone, a reminder of where his ring had split the skin. I pressed a gauze pad against the cut above my eyebrow, tasting copper on my tongue, and watched the familiar rhythm of the ER continue around me as if this were just another Tuesday night. 6 years. That's how long I'd been working as a nurse here at Sacred Heart Medical Center, building a life I'd clawed out of nothing. The overnight shifts were exhausting, the pay just enough to cover my studio apartment and student loans. But it was my work, my life, miles away from the nightmare of my childhood. I should have been on the other side of the nurse's station wearing my navy scrubs and triaging patients. Instead, I sat in exam bay 3 with a hospital blanket wrapped around my torn sweater, waiting for radiology to confirm whether my ribs were bruised or broken. The irony cut deeper than my stepfather's knuckles. I'd spent 12 years running from that man, building walls high enough that he couldn't reach me, but apparently not high enough. He'd found me 2 weeks before Christmas, showed up at my door with that same threatening smile, demanding money for his gambling debts. Money I didn't have. Money I wouldn't give him even if I did. The confrontation had been vicious and fast. He'd always been bigger than me, meaner, fueled by whatever poison he'd been drinking. When I told him to leave or I'd call the police, he'd backhanded me so hard I'd crashed into my kitchen counter. I'd grabbed the hot coffee pot and thrown it at his face, buying myself just enough time to run. The hospital was 3 blocks away, and I'd made it through the automatic doors before my knees gave out, leaving me gasping against the admissions desk while my coworkers rushed to catch me. Now, sitting under the fluorescent lights with holiday garland mocking me from the doorframe, I felt the familiar weight of humiliation settling into my bones. My colleagues pretended they didn't know me, but I caught the whispers, the pitying looks. Cynthia Morgan, the capable one who could handle any trauma case. Cynthia Morgan, who apparently couldn't handle her own. Cynthia? Stephen Turner, one of the ER residents, appeared at my bedside with a tablet in hand. His kind face creased with concern as he took in my injuries. I'd always appreciated Stephen's quiet competence, his respectful distance. He represented everything normal and safe that I'd been trying to build. X-rays backed up, he said gently. Should be about 20 minutes. Can I get you anything? Water? Something for the pain. I shook my head, then immediately regretted the movement. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket for the 7th time, but I ignored it. Nothing good ever came from answering my stepfather's calls. Stephen hesitated, then sat on the rolling stool beside my bed. Cynthia, I have to ask, do you want to file a police report? We can have security. The curtain to my exam bay slid open with a sharp metallic sound. And everything changed. The man who stepped through filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size, though he was tall, broad-shouldered, imposing in a way that made the cramped exam bay feel even smaller. He wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than my car, every line sharp and precise. Dark hair slicked back perfectly. The geometric tattoo on his neck caught the light like a brand, a mark of something dangerous and irreversible. But it was his face that stopped my breath. Sharp angles, controlled fury barely held in check, and eyes, dark, intense, knowing, that found mine and pinned me in place. The hospital's ambient noise seemed to drain away, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Stephen stood abruptly, stepping protectively between us. Sir, this is a restricted area. You can't. The man's gaze shifted to Stephen for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough to make the resident take an involuntary step back. Leave. One word. Quiet. Absolute. Stephen looked at me, torn between professional duty and primal self-preservation. I gave him the smallest nod, and after a moment's hesitation, he left, pulling the curtain closed behind him. We were alone. The man moved closer, his limp barely noticeable, favoring his left side slightly. I caught a glimpse of something dark on his crisp white shirt beneath the jacket.
Blood. Fresh.
For a moment, we simply stared at each other. The Christmas lights from the tree in the waiting room cast a warm glow that didn't match the cold tension crackling between us. Recognition flickered in those dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. Something that had been waiting 12 years to surface. Cynthia Morgan. My name on his lips was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a decade I'd tried to forget. You're Maria's daughter. My throat closed. My entire body went rigid despite the pain it caused my ribs. Steve Dante. The man my mother had worked for before she died. The man who'd sent flowers to her funeral. The man who'd anonymously paid for my nursing school. I'd found the paper trail 2 years ago and immediately tried to return the money. The man I'd hoped never to see again. Mr. Dante. I forced the words past the tightness in my chest, making them as formal as possible. I think you have the wrong room. I'm waiting for radiology. He stepped closer, and I pressed back instinctively against the raised hospital bed. Not from fear, not exactly, but from something more complicated. Something that made my skin prickle and my damaged face feel hot. I know exactly which room you're in, he said, his voice low and controlled, like a blade sheathed in velvet. I own this hospital. I own the building you work in. I know everything that happens within my city. His eyes tracked over my face with precision, the swollen eye, the split eyebrow, the bruising already darkening my cheek. Something dangerous shifted behind his carefully controlled expression. Who hurt you? 3 words. Simple. Devastating. I lifted my chin, trying to salvage some dignity despite the hospital gown and battered face. It doesn't matter. I handled it. You should go take care of whatever brought you here tonight. A muscle flexed in his jaw, the only crack in his otherwise perfect composure. Your stepfather. Not a question. A statement of fact. Of course he knew. Steve Dante didn't build an empire by being blind to what happened on his streets, in his buildings, to the daughter of a woman he'd once. I handled it. I repeated, though we both knew it was a lie. My stepfather would come back. He always came back. I don't need your help, Mr. Dante. I don't need anything from you. He moved closer still, near enough that I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that made my head feel light and my thoughts scatter. Your mother saved my life, he said quietly, each word deliberate. She asked me to watch over you, to keep you safe. I've done that from a distance for 12 years. I was there, I said, my voice sharper than intended. I remember. I also remember that you promised her you'd let me live my own life, that you'd stay away. Something shifted in his eyes, something primal and possessive that made my breath catch. That was before someone put their hands on you, he said, his voice dropping to something barely controlled. Before you walked into my hospital looking like you lost a fight you should never have been in. It's not your hospital, I said automatically, even though every person in this building would disagree. And I don't need your protection. His hand moved slow, deliberate, reaching toward my face. I flinched, and he froze, jaw tightening. Look at me, Cynthia. Against every instinct, I did. I've kept my distance for 12 years. I've honored your mother's wish to let you find your own path. But that ends tonight. His voice was soft, deadly, final. The man who did this to you, what's his name? I pressed my lips together, refusing to answer. His name, Cynthia.
No.
The word came out stronger than I felt. Whatever you're thinking, don't. I'm not dragging you into this. I'm not becoming the reason you. You think you have a choice? He leaned down, bringing his face level with mine. You stopped having a choice the moment he touched you. The moment you came through those doors with his fingerprints on your throat. I hadn't even realized my hand had moved to cover the marks there. Tell me his name, Steve said, each word carefully measured. And I promise you, by sunset tomorrow, this problem will be gone.
Erased.
You'll never have to look over your shoulder again. You can't just. I can, he interrupted. I will. The only question is whether you're going to fight me every step of the way, or whether you're going to let me do what I should have done 12 years ago. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. A text this time. I didn't need to look to know what it said. More threats. More demands. Steve's eyes dropped to my jacket pocket, then back to my face. His name, Cynthia. And despite everything I'd built, everything I'd fought for, everything I'd promised myself about staying away from men like him, I told him. The Christmas tree in the corner of the ER waiting room looked obscene next to the blood pressure monitor. Golden lights twinkled cheerfully against silver tinsel, reflecting off the linoleum in dancing patterns that made my head throb. Someone had hung candy canes on the lower branches, probably one of the pediatric nurses trying to make the space less terrifying for kids. All it did was make the metallic taste of blood in my mouth feel more wrong. I pressed myself against the wall beside it, one hand clutching a wad of gauze to my eyebrow, the other wrapped around my ribs. The tree was large enough to partially hide me from the nurse's station, which was exactly what I needed. If I could just stay here, quiet and small, maybe I could avoid the questions, the looks, the inevitable paperwork that would make this nightmare real and permanent. Through the branches, I watched the organized chaos of a night shift. Paramedics wheeled in a cardiac case, their voices sharp and urgent. A toddler screamed somewhere in Tria. The overhead speakers crackled with a code blue on the 4th floor. Tuesday night at Sacred Heart. Exactly like every other Tuesday night I'd worked for the past 6 years, except I was on the wrong side of the action. Cynthia? I flinched, turning my face further into the shadows as Stephen Turner's voice cut through the noise. His footsteps approached, deliberate and concerned. I could picture him scanning the waiting room, that furrow between his eyebrows deepening when he couldn't immediately locate me. I know you're here, he said, closer now. Admissions said you refused a wheelchair.
Of course they did.
I squeezed my eyes shut, the good one and the swollen one, and tried to make myself invisible. It didn't work. It never worked. Stephen appeared at the edge of the Christmas tree, his tablet tucked under one arm, a styrofoam cup of water in his hand. His expression when he saw me was everything I'd been trying to avoid.
Shock.
Anger. That terrible, suffocating pity that made my stomach turn. Jesus, Cynthia. He moved toward me, then stopped himself, clearly uncertain whether touching me would cause more harm. How long have you been standing here? I'm fine, I said automatically, though my voice came out rough and unconvincing. Just needed a minute. You need a CT scan and x-rays. His doctor voice firm but gentle. And probably stitches for that eyebrow. Come on, let me get you to an exam room. I shook my head, immediately regretting the movement as pain lanced through my skull. It's busy tonight. Other people need. Don't. Stephen cut me off, his jaw tight. Don't do that. Don't minimize this. A red ornament hung at eye level, reflecting my distorted face back at me.
Swollen. Bruised. Broken.
I looked away. Who did this to you? Stephen asked quietly. Before I could answer, before I could even decide whether to lie, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. Once.
Twice.
3 times in rapid succession. Text messages. I didn't need to look to know who they were from. The same person who'd sent 15 calls in the last hour. Stephen's eyes dropped to my pocket, understanding dawning across his features. "Someone's harassing you." "It's handled," I whispered, but we both heard the lie. The automatic doors at the far end of the ER hissed open, letting in a blast of cold December air and something else. Something that made every nerve in my body go still. Even hidden behind the Christmas tree, even with my vision blurred and my head spinning, I felt it. A shift in the atmosphere. A presence that didn't belong in this fluorescent-lit world of bedside charts and hand sanitizer. Stephen felt it too. He straightened, turning toward the entrance with the instinctive wariness of prey sensing a predator. And through the golden lights and silver tinsel, I saw him. Steve Dante walked through my hospital like he owned it. Because he did. The ER didn't go silent all at once. It was more like a wave, starting at the entrance and rippling outward. The admissions clerk stopped mid-sentence, her hand frozen over her keyboard. A nurse pushing a medication cart simply stopped walking, her eyes wide and fixed. Even the cardiac patient's monitor seemed to beat more quietly, as if the machines themselves recognized the presence of something beyond their programming. Steve Dante moved through the chaos with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no, never having been stopped, never having feared a single person in any room he entered. He was tall, taller than I'd remembered from the funeral, though I'd been 16 and drowning in grief. Broad-shouldered in a way that the perfectly tailored black suit emphasized rather than hid. Every line of the jacket had been cut to showcase power, from the sharp angle of the lapels to the way it tapered at his waist. Beneath it, a black dress shirt and black tie created an almost ceremonial effect, like he was dressed for something sacred. Or something fatal. But it was the details that made my breath catch. The geometric tattoo that wrapped around the left side of his neck, dark lines and angles that disappeared beneath his collar and emerged again at his wrist, crawling across the back of his hand like a brand. A mark that said he belonged to something most people only whispered about. Something that existed in the spaces between laws and lived by codes written in blood. His face was sharp, angular, carved from stone and ice. Dark hair slicked back with precision, not a strand out of place despite the late hour. And his eyes, dark, intense, focused, swept across the ER with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. Cataloged everything. Calculated threat levels and weaknesses before most people even registered his presence. He limped, favoring his right side, but it didn't diminish him. If anything, it made him more dangerous. A wounded predator was always the most vicious. Mr. Dante. The ER supervisor, Patricia Chun, materialized from somewhere near Tria, her professional smile locked in place despite the tremor in her hands. "We weren't expecting. Where is she?" His voice cut through her pleasantries like a blade, low and controlled, but carrying enough authority that Patricia actually took a step backward. "Sir, I'm not sure who." "Cynthia Morgan." 2 words. A command disguised as a statement. Patricia's eyes flickered toward the Christmas tree, toward me, before she could stop herself. Steve's gaze followed instantly, unerringly, finding me through the golden lights and silver tinsel like a predator's spotting movement in tall grass. Our eyes locked. Time seemed to slow, thicken, become something viscous and heavy. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only stand there with gauze pressed to my bleeding eyebrow, while Steve Dante looked at me the way a king might look at a subject who'd wandered too far from the castle walls. Recognition flashed across his features, followed by something darker. Something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. He started walking again, directly toward me, and the ER parted around him like water around a shark. A young resident stumbled backward into a crash cart. A patient waiting for stitches pressed himself against the wall. Even Patricia, with 15 years of ER experience and nerves of steel, retreated to the safety of the nurse's station. Stephen Turner, to his credit, didn't move. He stepped in front of me, positioning himself between Steve and the Christmas tree, his shoulders square despite the fact that he was outmatched in every conceivable way. "Sir, this patient requires medical attention. If you need to speak with someone, the administrative offices." Steve stopped 3 feet away, his dark eyes never leaving Stephen's face. "Move." One word. Quiet. Final. "I'm her physician," Stephen said, and I heard the tremor he was trying to hide. "I can't allow. You're a second-year resident who makes $48,000 a year and drives a 2015 Honda Civic." Steve's voice remained perfectly level, almost conversational. "I employ 230 people in this hospital alone. I fund the cardiology wing, the NICU expansion, and the trauma center you're currently standing in." He took one step closer, and Stephen's composure cracked visibly. "So when I tell you to move, Dr. Turner, you move. Or you find out what happens when someone gets between me and something that belongs to me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the monitors seemed to hold their breath. Stephen looked at me, his face torn between professional duty and primal survival instinct. I saw the exact moment he understood that this wasn't a fight he could win. That this man wasn't someone who could be reasoned with or stopped by hospital policy or any law written in any book. I gave him the smallest nod, releasing him from the impossible position I'd put him in just by existing. He stepped aside, and Steve Dante filled my entire world. He was close enough now that I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that didn't belong in this antiseptic world of hand sanitizer and industrial cleaner. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, which was a mistake because it made the Christmas lights blur and swim behind him like halos around something decidedly unholy. "Mr. Dante." I forced the words past the tightness in my throat, making them as formal as possible, as distant as I could manage when he was standing close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. "You shouldn't be here. I own this hospital." His voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I can be anywhere I want." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." His eyes tracked across my face with clinical precision, cataloging each injury with the kind of focus that made my skin feel too tight. The swollen eye. The split eyebrow still bleeding through the gauze. The bruising already darkening my cheekbone. "You meant that I promised your mother I'd stay away. That I'd let you build your own life without interference from my world." Something in my chest cracked at the mention of her. "Then honor that promise. Please." I did. He reached up slowly, telegraphing the movement like someone trying not to spook a wounded animal, and gently pulled my hand away from the gauze pressed to my eyebrow. His fingers were warm, surprisingly careful, but marked with the same geometric tattoos that wrapped his neck. "For 12 years, Cynthia. I kept my distance. I don't need your nursing school tuition." He cut me off, still examining my injuries with that unnerving focus. 4 years at Sacred Heart University. $63,000 in total costs. Where did you think that money came from? My stomach dropped. I had scholarships. Financial aid. You had one partial scholarship that covered 30% of your first year. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, just below the worst of the bruising, and I flinched. He didn't pull away. "The rest was paid by a trust fund established in your mother's name. A trust fund I created 3 days after her funeral."
"No."
The word came out strangled. "I would have known. I would have seen. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see. Official-looking paperwork from lawyers you'd never met, dispersing funds from an account you assumed your mother had somehow managed to create despite working 2 minimum-wage jobs her entire life. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. You wanted to believe she'd found a way to take care of you even after death. So you believed it. The Christmas tree lights blurred again, but this time it had nothing to do with my injuries. You had no right. I had every right. She saved my life. He finally released my hand, but only to cut my jaw, tilting my face toward the harsh fluorescent lights for a better view of the damage. Do you know what she said to me while she was bleeding out on that sidewalk? While the ambulance was still 6 minutes away and we both knew she wouldn't make it? I didn't want to know. I'd spent 12 years trying not to imagine those final moments. She said, "Promise me you'll watch over her. Promise me she'll never have to be afraid." His voice dropped lower, something dangerous threading through the careful control. I gave her my word. A man in my position doesn't make promises lightly, Cynthia. And we never break them. Watching over me from a distance is one thing. I tried to pull away from his hand, but his grip tightened just enough to keep me in place. Not painful, but absolutely immovable. "This is the apartment you live in," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Do you know why the rent is so affordable in that neighborhood? Why you've never had a break-in despite living on the ground floor with windows that don't lock properly?" The building's superintendent's face flashed through my mind. Mr. Kowalski, who'd always seemed oddly protective, who'd installed motion sensor lights without being asked, who'd somehow always been there when I came home late from night shifts. "The car accident your stepfather had 6 years ago," Steve said, watching my face with that unsettling intensity. "The one that kept him in the hospital for 3 months and gave you enough time to graduate and disappear. Do you think that was coincidence?" My blood ran cold. What did you do? What needed to be done? His brakes failed on a wet road. These things happen. His expression remained perfectly neutral, but his eyes told a different story. Just like jobs sometimes dry up. Apartments become unavailable. Bars refuse service. Parole officers become suddenly very interested in compliance checks. "You've been..." I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't wrap my mind around the scope of what he was describing. "Keeping the wolves at bay," he finished for me. "Creating a buffer between you and the ugliness you were running from. Making sure you had the space and safety to become exactly what your mother hoped you'd be. A healer. Someone who saves lives instead of watching them end. That wasn't your choice to make. It was a promise I made to a dying woman I owed everything to." His hand dropped from my face, but he didn't step back. If anything, he moved closer until I was pressed against the wall beside the Christmas tree with nowhere to go. For 12 years, I kept that promise from the shadows. Made sure you never had to know about the deals I made, the pressure I applied, the threats I issued to keep you safe. Then why are you here now? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Why break your cover after all this time? His jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd walked through those doors, I saw the carefully maintained control slip. Just a fraction. Just enough to glimpse the fury banked beneath the surface. Because keeping the wolves at bay is one thing. His voice dropped to something cold and deadly. But I draw the line at someone putting their hands on you. At someone marking you with bruises and sending you running into my hospital bleeding and afraid. He leaned in, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, close enough that anyone watching would think this was something intimate instead of something territorial. Your stepfather crossed a line tonight, Cynthia. And I don't forgive lines being crossed. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Another text. Another threat. Another reminder that this nightmare wasn't over. Steve's eyes dropped to my jacket, then back to my face. "Tell me his name," he said quietly, "and I'll make sure he never crosses another line again." The phone felt like a live grenade in my hand, even though the call had ended. Steve's promise echoed in my ears. "Keep you safe, no matter the cost, and I knew exactly what cost he meant. What price men like him extracted from people who cross lines they shouldn't have crossed. I need to sit down. The words came out dizzy, disconnected, like someone else was speaking through my mouth. The adrenaline that had been holding me together was draining away, leaving nothing but pain and exhaustion in its wake. Steve's hand was at my elbow instantly, steadying me. There's a private consultation room. Second floor. Away from. He gestured vaguely at the ER, at the nurses pretending not to watch us, at Stephen hovering near the radiology desk with his tablet and his impotent concern. Away from all of this. I should have argued. Should have insisted on staying in the public space of the ER, where there were witnesses and protocols, and the illusion of safety. But my legs were shaking, my ribs screaming with each breath, and the swelling around my eye had gotten worse. I could feel it pulsing in time with my heartbeat. "Okay," I whispered. He guided me through the ER with one hand at the small of my back, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the heat of his palm through my thin jacket. The staff parted around us like we were radioactive. No one asked where we were going. No one suggested I needed X-rays or a CT scan or any of the standard trauma protocols I knew by heart. Steve Dante had spoken. The hospital obeyed. The elevator ride to the second floor was silent except for the mechanical hum of the cables and my own ragged breathing. Steve stood perfectly still beside me, hands clasped in front of him, but I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. Controlled.
Contained. Barely.
The consultation room was exactly what I expected: beige walls, uncomfortable chairs, a box of tissues on a small table for delivering bad news to families. Steve closed the door behind us and locked it with a quiet click that seemed impossibly loud. "Sit." Not a request. I lowered myself into one of the chairs, wincing as my ribs protested the movement. The adrenaline was completely gone now, replaced by the full, aching reality of what Ray had done. My face throbbed. My head pounded. Every breath hurt. Steve stood in front of me, perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking over my injuries with that same clinical precision he'd shown downstairs. But something was different now. Something in his expression had shifted, hardened, like watching metal cool into a blade. "Take off your jacket." I looked up at him, confused. "What?" "Your jacket. Take it off." His voice remained level, but there was an edge to it now. Something sharp and dangerous lurking beneath the control. "I need to see the extent of the damage." "Steve, I don't think." "That wasn't a request, Cynthia." My hands moved before my brain could process the decision, shrugging out of the jacket despite every instinct telling me this was a bad idea. The hospital blanket I'd wrapped around myself earlier had slipped, and now I sat in just the torn green sweater I'd been wearing when Ray attacked me. Steve's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The sweater had ridden up during the struggle, and even without looking, I knew what he was seeing. The bruises on my ribs where Ray's fists had connected. The fingerprint marks on my upper arms where he'd grabbed me. The scrape on my collarbone from when he'd slammed me against the kitchen counter. "Stand up. Steve. Stand up." I stood, my legs trembling, and watched his face as he took in the full inventory of Ray's violence. The swollen eye, the split eyebrow, the bruising along my jaw, the marks on my throat that I'd been trying to hide. And then he saw my wrists. I'd forgotten about my wrists. Forgotten that when I'd thrown the coffee pot at Ray, he'd grabbed both my arms and twisted them behind my back, pinning me against the wall while he whispered all the things he was going to do to me if I didn't give him the money. The bruises there were dark, distinct, unmistakably handprints. Something in Steve's expression cracked. It wasn't a big crack. Not obvious. But I'd been reading people's faces in the ER for 6 years, learning to spot the moment when control slipped and emotion broke through. I saw it now. Saw the careful mask he wore fracture, just enough to glimpse what lived beneath.
Rage.
Not the hot, explosive kind. Not the type that shouted and broke things and burned itself out quickly. This was cold, patient. The kind of fury that planned and calculated and waited for exactly the right moment to strike. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and took one of my wrists in his hand. His thumb traced the edge of the bruise with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone radiating such violence. "Who hurt you?" 3 words. Simple. Devastating. Spoken so quietly, I almost didn't hear them. But it wasn't really a question. Not anymore. He knew who. He'd heard Ray's voice on the phone, heard the threats and demands and venom. This was something else. Something more fundamental. A ritual. A line being drawn in sand that was about to turn to blood. "You know who," I whispered. "I need to hear you say it." His grip on my wrist tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt but enough to anchor me. "I need you to give me his name and tell me what he did. All of it." "Why?" My voice cracked. "So, you can feel justified in whatever you're planning? So you can tell yourself this is about honor instead of. So, I know exactly how much he needs to suffer before he dies." The words hung in the air between us, stark and terrible and absolutely sincere. I should have been horrified. Should have pulled away, called for help, done something to stop what was about to happen. But instead, I looked at the bruises on my wrists, felt the throbbing in my face, tasted blood in my mouth, and felt something dark and shameful unfurl in my chest. Relief. "Ray Morgan," I said, my voice steady now.
Clear.
"My stepfather. He's been terrorizing me since I was 14. Since the night my mother died, saving your life." Steve's thumb continued its gentle circuit around the bruise, but his eyes had gone completely cold. Empty. Like looking into the eyes of something that had stopped being entirely human. He came to my apartment tonight demanding $20,000. When I refused to let him in, he grabbed me by the hair and slammed my head against the brick wall. The words came easier now, like lancing a wound. He punched me 3 times, face, ribs, stomach. He twisted my wrists behind my back and told me he'd make me regret being born. That he'd finish what should have happened the night my mother died. Anything else? I pulled up the sleeve of my sweater, revealing older bruises. Yellowing marks from 2 weeks ago when Ray had found me at the grocery store. He's been escalating. Getting bolder. I thought if I just kept quiet, kept moving, he'd eventually give up. He won't give up. Steve released my wrist and cupped my face instead, tilting it toward the harsh fluorescent light to examine the split eyebrow more closely. Men like him never do. They see vulnerability as invitation. Silence as permission. So what do I do? His eyes met mine, and what I saw there should have terrified me. Should have sent me running. Instead, it felt like standing in front of a fire after years of freezing. "You do nothing," he said quietly. "You let me do what I should have done 12 years ago, when your mother first told me about him. You let me keep the promise I made to a dying woman." And what promise was that? A smile touched his lips, cold and terrible and beautiful. That her daughter would never be afraid again. That anyone who hurt you would disappear so completely, it would be like they never existed at all. He stepped back, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "By sunset tomorrow, Cynthia, your stepfather will be gone. And you'll never have to look over your shoulder again." Steve's office occupied the top floor of the hospital's administrative wing, accessible only by private elevator and requiring a key card I didn't have. He'd given me his, along with instructions delivered in that same quiet, absolute tone. "Wait here, don't leave, don't answer your phone if Ray calls again." I hadn't argued. The office was exactly what I'd expected, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than I made in a year, shelves lined with medical journals he probably never read, and bottles of liquor he definitely did. But it was the view that held my attention. From this height, I could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the winter sky in shades of orange and gold. "Sunset tomorrow," he'd said. But looking at the clock on his desk, 4:47 p.m., I realized he'd meant today. In just over an hour, whatever he'd set in motion would be complete. I sat in the leather chair behind his desk because standing made my ribs hurt and pacing made my head spin. A doctor had finally been allowed to see me, someone Steve trusted, someone who asked no questions about how I'd gotten the injuries or why I was being treated in the CEO's private office instead of ER. She'd confirmed no broken bones, just deep bruising and a mild concussion. She'd stitched my eyebrow with efficient, practiced hands and given me a prescription for pain medication I probably wouldn't fill. Then she'd left, and I was alone with the ticking clock and the setting sun and the terrible knowledge of what was happening somewhere in the city. My phone sat on the desk in front of me, silent now. Ray hadn't called again after Steve's warning. I told myself that was a good sign, that maybe he'd been scared off, that maybe Steve's threat had been enough to send him running. But I knew better. Men like Ray didn't scare easily. And men like Steve didn't make threats they didn't intend to keep. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. One call. That's all it would take. Tell the police my stepfather was in danger, that a crime boss had threatened him, that something terrible was about to happen. But then what? Ray would deny everything. Claim I was crazy, vindictive, trying to get him in trouble because he'd asked me to repay money I owed. The bruises on my face would become evidence of my instability. I'd gotten into a fight, attacked him first, he was just defending himself. The system would grind forward with its forms and procedures and restraining orders that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. And Ray would still be out there, waiting, watching, finding new ways to make me pay for the crime of being my mother's daughter. I set the phone down. The sun sank lower, touching the tops of distant buildings. 5:23 p.m. Somewhere in the city, Steve Dante was keeping a promise made to a dying woman. Somewhere, my stepfather was learning what happened when you hurt something that belonged to a man who owned half the city and all of its shadows. I should have felt guilty. Should have felt horror at what I'd set in motion by giving Steve that name, by detailing every bruise and threat and moment of terror Ray had inflicted over 12 years. But all I felt was numb, hollow. Like I'd been holding my breath for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. The door opened without warning. I jerked upright, pain shooting through my ribs, and found Steve standing in the doorway. He looked exactly the same as he had an hour ago, tailored suit, slicked hair, controlled expression. But there was something different in his eyes. A satisfaction. A completion. "Is it done?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "What do you think?" I looked past him to the windows, to the sun now barely visible above the skyline, bleeding the last of its light across the winter sky. 5:47 p.m. 13 minutes until sunset. "I think," I said slowly, "that you're a man who keeps his promises." He crossed to the desk, moving with that slight limp that somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. When he reached me, he didn't sit in one of the guest chairs. Instead, he leaned against the desk, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. "Your stepfather made several mistakes today," he said conversationally, like he was discussing the weather. "The first was finding you. The second was putting his hands on you. The third was answering his phone when one of my associates called with an offer to settle his gambling debts." My heart stuttered. "What kind of offer?" The kind that required him to meet someone in person. Alone. In a warehouse on the east side that I happened to own. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He arrived 20 minutes ago. Very punctual, considering how drunk he was. Steve. He's gone, Cynthia. Simple. Final. The man who terrorized you for 12 years, who killed your mother's spirit long before she took that bullet, who dared to mark you with his violence, he doesn't exist anymore. The words should have devastated me, should have broken whatever was left of my moral compass. Instead, I felt something inside my chest loosen, unclench, like a fist that had been squeezing my lungs for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe deeply. What did you do to him? Nothing he didn't deserve. Steve reached out and traced the edge of the bandage on my eyebrow with one finger. Nothing that will ever be found. No body. No evidence. No investigation. Just a man with a history of violence and addiction who finally pushed the wrong person and disappeared into the kind of darkness men like him create. The police won't care. Ray Morgan has an extensive criminal record, multiple restraining orders, outstanding warrants in 2 states. When he doesn't show up for his parole meeting next week, they'll assume he skipped town, ran from his debts. Maybe died in a gutter somewhere. His hand moved from my eyebrow to my cheek, cupping my face with that same impossible gentleness. No one will look for him, and even if they did, they wouldn't find anything. Through the window behind him, the sun touched the horizon, orange and gold bleeding into purple and blue. The last light of the day painting the sky in colors that should have been beautiful, but felt like something else entirely. An ending. A beginning. A line crossed that could never be uncrossed. How do you feel? Steve asked quietly. I searched myself for guilt, for horror, for any of the emotions a decent person should feel when learning someone had been murdered on their behalf. But all I found was a vast, echoing silence, where fear used to live. Free, I whispered. His thumb traced my cheekbone, avoiding the worst of the bruising.
Good.
The sun slipped below the horizon, taking the last of the light with it. Darkness settled over the city like a blanket, soft and complete and absolute. Somewhere in that darkness, my stepfather's body was being erased, dissolved, made to disappear so thoroughly that even memory might forget he'd existed. And somewhere in the growing night, I sat in a Mafia boss's office and felt safer than I'd felt in 12 years. Steve's phone buzzed once. He glanced at it, read something on the screen, then slipped it back into his pocket. When he looked at me again, there was finality in his expression. It's done, he said. You're safe now. No one will ever hurt you again. I believed him. God help me, I believed him. The city lights began to flicker on below us, thousands of tiny points of illumination pushing back against the dark. From this height, they looked almost beautiful, almost innocent. But I knew better now. I knew what lived in the spaces between those lights. What kind of men ruled the shadows and kept promises written in blood. And I knew that I'd just traded one kind of cage for another. The question was whether I'd just been rescued or captured. Looking at Steve's face in the growing darkness, I wasn't sure there was a difference. The car that waited for us in the hospital's private underground garage was exactly what I expected, sleek, black, expensive enough to feed a family for a year. What I didn't expect was the man standing beside it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes that assessed me with the cold efficiency of someone trained to identify threats. Marcus, Steve said by way of introduction. He'll be driving us. Not taking us. Not giving us a ride. Driving us, like it was his sole purpose, his profession. I slid into the back seat, the leather so soft it felt like silk, and tried not to think about what kind of man employed a private driver who looked like he could kill someone with his bare hands. Then I remembered what had just happened to Ray, and realized I already knew exactly what kind of man Steve Dante was. The city passed by the tinted windows in a blur of lights and shadows. Steve sat beside me, not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell that dark, expensive cologne that seemed to cling to everything he owned. He made a phone call in a language I didn't recognize, Italian maybe, or something older, his voice low and controlled as always. Giving orders. Receiving confirmations. Running an empire from the back seat of a car while I sat beside him with stitches in my eyebrow and bruises on my wrists. Where are we going? I finally asked when he ended the call. Home. He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned to look at me. You can't go back to your apartment. Ray knew where you lived. If he told anyone he was going after you tonight, they might come looking. Ask questions. So, I'm just supposed to, what? Move in with you? Temporarily. His expression gave nothing away. Until we're certain there are no loose ends. Loose ends. Like my entire life was a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed. I wanted to argue, to insist I could take care of myself, that I didn't need his protection or his home or any of this. But the words died in my throat because we both knew they'd be lies. I had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. The moment I'd given Steve my stepfather's name, I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The car turned off the main highway onto a private road that wound through trees I didn't know existed this close to the city. The further we drove, the larger the properties became, estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates that spoke of old money and older secrets. Then we rounded a curve and I saw it. The Dante estate rose from the landscape like something out of a dark fairy tale. A massive stone mansion, 3 stories of Gothic architecture and sharp angles, illuminated by lights that made it glow against the night sky. The gates that barred the entrance were wrought iron, 12 feet high, topped with points that looked less decorative and more defensive. As we approached, the gates swung open silently, operated by someone I couldn't see. This is where you live. The words came out hushed, overwhelmed. This is where I exist, Steve corrected. There's a difference. Marcus drove us through the gates and up a circular driveway paved in stone that looked hand-laid. Manicured gardens flanked both sides, dormant now in winter, but clearly maintained with obsessive precision. Even in the darkness, I could see the fountain at the center of the circle, some classical sculpture of figures I couldn't quite make out. The car stopped at the base of wide stone steps leading to massive wooden doors. Before I could reach for the handle, Marcus was there, opening it with practiced efficiency. I stepped out into the cold December air and stared up at the mansion that would apparently be my prison. Or sanctuary. I still couldn't decide which. Cynthia. Steve's hand appeared at the small of my back, guiding me forward. Welcome home. The doors opened before we reached them, pulled by a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. She wore all black, simple, elegant, like a uniform that wasn't quite a uniform. Mr. Dante. She inclined her head slightly, then her eyes moved to me, taking in the bruises, the stitches, the torn clothing I was still wearing under my jacket. If she was surprised or concerned, her face showed nothing. Miss Morgan, I presume. Mrs. Chun, Steve said. She manages the household. Anything you need, ask her. Mrs. Chun stepped aside, and I walked through the doors into another world. The entrance hall was cavernous, all dark wood and marble floors that gleamed under the light of a chandelier that probably cost more than my entire education. A grand staircase swept upward to the second floor, the banister carved with intricate designs that looked handcrafted. Paintings lined the walls, original oils, I realized, not prints, depicting scenes of violence barely disguised as classical art. This wasn't just wealth. This was dynasty, legacy, power accumulated over generations and displayed with the casual confidence of those who never questioned their right to it. "Your room is prepared," Mrs. Chen said, her voice crisp and professional. "Second floor, east wing. I've laid out some clothes that should fit until we can arrange for your belongings to be retrieved." "I can go back myself," I started, but Steve's hand tightened slightly on my back. "You won't be going anywhere alone," he said quietly. "Not until I'm satisfied you're safe." Not until he was satisfied. Not until I felt safe. The distinction was small but significant. Mrs. Chen gestured toward the staircase. "If you'll follow me, Miss Morgan." I looked at Steve, some part of me still waiting for permission, even though I hated myself for it. He nodded once, releasing me, and I followed Mrs. Chen up the stairs on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The second floor was just as overwhelming as the first. Long hallways lined with more paintings, more evidence of wealth so vast it had become decorative. Mrs. Chen led me to a door at the end of the east wing and pushed it open. The room beyond was larger than my entire apartment. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in silk that looked like it cost more than my car. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the grounds, currently showing nothing but darkness and my own reflection. A fireplace was already lit, casting warm light across furniture that belonged in a museum. On the bed lay clothes, expensive, tailored, in colors that somehow matched the bruises on my face. "The bathroom is through there." Mrs. Chen pointed to a door on the left. "Fully stocked. Mr. Dante thought you might want to clean up. Dinner will be served at 8 if you feel up to joining him." If I felt up to it, like I had a choice, like any of this was optional. "Thank you," I managed, my voice small in the vast space. Mrs. Chen nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Miss Morgan, a word of advice, if I may." I waited. This house's rules. Unspoken ones, mostly, but important nonetheless. The most important is this. Mr. Dante's protection is absolute, but it comes with expectations. As long as you're under this roof, you're part of his world, his territory, and territory must be defended. She didn't wait for a response, just pulled the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. I stood alone in the gilded cage, surrounded by luxury that felt like chains, and finally understood what I'd traded my freedom for. Safety, yes. Protection, absolutely. But also ownership. Through the window, I could see the gates we'd driven through, closed now, sealing me inside. The iron points at the top caught the moonlight, sharp and unforgiving. I'd spent 12 years running from one kind of prison only to walk willingly into another. The difference was that this cage was beautiful, and the monster who kept it promised he'd never let anyone hurt me again. I just had to accept that he was the only one allowed to keep me. I didn't go down for dinner. Instead, I stood under the shower in the bathroom that was larger than my old bedroom, letting water hot enough to hurt wash away the hospital smell and the blood and the feeling of Ray's hands on my skin. The clothes Mrs. Chen had left fit perfectly. Soft cashmere sweater in deep burgundy. Black pants that somehow knew my exact measurements. I didn't want to think about how Steve had known my size, what kind of surveillance that implied. By the time I emerged, wrapped in luxury that felt like a costume, night had fully settled over the estate. Through the windows, I could see nothing but darkness and the distant glow of the city I'd left behind. A city where a man had disappeared without a trace. Where I'd given the order, because that's what it had been, really, when I'd told Steve my stepfather's name. A knock at the door made me jump, pain shooting through my bruised ribs. "It's me." Steve's voice, muffled by the thick wood. I opened the door to find him changed as well. The formal suit replaced by dark slacks and a black sweater that made him look less like a CEO and more like exactly what he was. Dangerous.
Controlled.
Beautiful, in the way a blade was beautiful. "You didn't come to dinner." Not an accusation. Just an observation. I wasn't hungry. He studied me for a moment, those dark eyes tracking over my face, assessing whether I was lying or simply in shock. "May I come in?" The question surprised me. In his own house, asking permission to enter a room. I stepped back, and he moved past me with that slight limp, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The fireplace was still burning, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Steve walked to it, standing with his back to the flames, and I realized this was intentional. Positioning himself so I could see his face clearly, so there were no shadows to hide behind. "You think I'm a monster?" Not a question. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the fire and the expensive sweater. "I think you killed a man today." I did. No hesitation. No justification. "I've killed many men, Cynthia. Some who deserved it, like your stepfather. Some who were simply in the way of something I wanted. Some because that's what's required to maintain power in the world I inhabit." The casual honesty was somehow worse than a lie would have been. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know exactly what you've stepped into. What I am." He moved closer, slowly, like approaching something wild that might bolt. "You're standing in my home, wearing clothes I provided, protected by walls I've built with violence and blood. You need to understand what that means." I understand perfectly. The words came out sharper than I intended. "You've made me complicit in murder. You've trapped me in this beautiful prison, and now you want me to what? Thank you? Accept that this is my life now. I want you to see me clearly." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that the firelight caught the angles of his face, the tattoos on his neck. "Not as a savior or a captor or whatever narrative you're constructing to make sense of this. I want you to see the truth." "And what truth is that?" He reached up slowly and began unbuttoning his sweater. I tensed, confused, but he simply pulled it off and turned, showing me his back.
Scars.
Dozens of them, crisscrossing the muscular expanse of his shoulders and spine like a map of violence. Some were thin, surgical. Others were ragged, brutal. One looked like it had been made by a blade that had nearly killed him. "I was 12 when I got the first one," he said, his voice distant, remembering. "My father's enforcer, teaching me what happens to boys who flinch during executions. By the time I was 16, I'd stopped counting. Stopped flinching. Stopped feeling much of anything except the cold calculation required to survive." He turned back to face me, pulling the sweater on again with economical movements. I became exactly what this world required me to be. A monster. Efficient, ruthless, incapable of the weakness that gets men killed in my profession. Then why tell me this? Why show me? Because monsters can still love, Cynthia. The words stopped me cold. Just because I'm capable of ordering a man's death before sunset doesn't mean I'm incapable of keeping a promise to a dying woman. Of watching from the shadows as her daughter builds a life, proud of every accomplishment, furious at every obstacle. Of falling. He cut himself off, jaw tightening. Of falling what? My voice came out barely a whisper. In love with someone I had no right to even look at. He moved closer, and I found myself rooted in place, unable to retreat or advance. "Do you know how many times I've stood outside that hospital during your night shifts? How many times I've had men follow you home just to make sure you arrived safely? How many job offers I've quietly sabotaged because they would have taken you to another city, beyond my ability to protect you. The confession should have horrified me, should have confirmed every fear about control and obsession. But all I could think about was 12 years of invisible protection. 12 years of someone watching, caring, ensuring I survived. You had no right, I said, but the words lacked conviction. I had every right. Your mother gave it to me, with her dying breath. He was close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the way the firelight reflected in his dark eyes. She said, "Promise me you'll love her the way I couldn't, the way her father never did. Promise me someone will see her as precious." My breath caught. She didn't say that.
She did.
You were in the ambulance with the paramedics, and she used her last coherent moments to make me swear I'd give you what she couldn't.
Safety.
Resources. And yes, love, even if from a distance you'd never know about. Tears burned behind my eyes, mixing with the pain of my injuries and the overwhelming complexity of everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. You're telling me you've been in love with me since I was 16? That's disturbing? Inappropriate? Monstrous? A bitter smile touched his lips. Yes to all of it.
I didn't act on it.
Didn't even let myself fully acknowledge it until you were well into adulthood. But the truth is, I've spent 12 years watching you become exactly the woman your mother hoped you'd be, and somewhere in that time, protection became something more. That's not love. That's obsession. Perhaps. The line is thin when you're someone like me. He reached up and gently touched the bandage on my eyebrow, the gesture achingly tender. But obsessive or not, it's the closest thing to love a monster like me is capable of feeling. And it's yours whether you want it or not. I should have pulled away. Should have demanded he take me back to the city, back to my life, back to anything resembling normal. But normal had never been safe. Normal had been Ray finding me, hurting me, making me live in constant fear. What do you want from me? I whispered. Nothing you're not ready to give. His hand moved from my eyebrow to cut my cheek, careful of the bruises. Stay here. Heal. Let me show you that the cage I've built is also a sanctuary. That the monster who loves you will defend you more fiercely than any man ever could. And if I want to leave? Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or fear of a kind I didn't think men like him could feel. Then I'll let you go. I'll continue to protect you from the shadows. Make sure you're safe, but I won't force you to stay in a world you hate. You're lying.
No.
The word was firm, absolute. I've done terrible things, Cynthia. I'll do terrible things again. But I won't become your captor. Won't turn into another Ray, using force to keep you close. That's not love. That's the opposite of everything your mother asked me to give you. The fire crackled behind him, casting our shadows long across the walls. Outside, the winter wind picked up, rattling the windows of the gilded cage that was somehow, impossibly, starting to feel less like a prison. I don't know if I can love a monster, I said honestly. He smiled, sad and knowing. I don't expect you to. I just need you to understand that monsters are capable of it. That what I feel for you is as real as anything a better man might offer, even if it comes wrapped in violence and darkness. His hand dropped from my face, and he stepped back, giving me space I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. Get some rest, he said quietly. Tomorrow we'll figure out the practicalities, retrieving your things, notifying the hospital you need time off. Tonight, just let yourself be safe. He turned toward the door, and before I could stop myself, I spoke. Steve. He paused, looking back. Thank you. For keeping your promise to her. For, my voice cracked. For seeing me as precious. The smile that crossed his face transformed it completely, making him look younger, less burdened, almost human. "Always," he said. Then he was gone, and I was alone with the fire and the truth that terrified me most. That maybe, just maybe, I was starting to see him the same way. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I'd forgotten to close, painting the unfamiliar room in shades of gold that seemed obscene after so much darkness. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then the pain in my ribs reminded me, the ache in my face, the stiffness in my wrists where bruises had bloomed overnight into their full, terrible color. Ray was gone. The thought arrived with my first conscious breath, stark and absolute. Not missing. Not in hiding. Gone. The way Steve had promised, erased so completely that even the memory of fear felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. I should have felt guilty. Should have spent the night staring at the ceiling, consumed by what I'd done, what I'd allowed to be done. But I'd slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in 12 years. 8 hours of sleep uninterrupted by the anxiety of wondering if Ray would find me, hurt me, destroy whatever small piece of life I'd managed to build. The clothes I'd worn last night were folded neatly on a chair I didn't remember folding them on. In their place, new options appeared on the bed, a selection of outfits in my size, casual but expensive, each one chosen with care that suggested someone had been paying attention to more than just measurements. Someone had noticed I preferred darker colors, simpler cuts, comfort over flash. I showered again, slower this time, examining the bruises in the mirror with the clinical detachment I'd learned in nursing school. The swelling around my eye had gone down slightly. The stitches on my eyebrow were healing clean. The fingerprints on my wrists were fading from purple to yellow-green. Evidence of violence, yes, but also evidence of survival. When I finally made my way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and something baking, I found Mrs. Chun in a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. She worked with efficient precision, arranging pastries on a plate, pouring coffee into a china cup that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. "Good morning, Miss Morgan." She didn't look up from her work. "Mr. Dante is in his study. Third door on the left. He's expecting you." Not asking if I wanted to see him. Not suggesting I might prefer breakfast alone. Just stating facts with the confidence of someone who knew the house's rhythms better than I knew my own heartbeat. I found the study exactly where she'd indicated. The door was open, and through it I could see Steve sitting behind a massive desk, his attention focused on a laptop screen. He'd changed again, back to the formal attire of tailored suit and crisp shirt, every line precise and controlled. The man from last night who'd shown me his scars and confessed his monstrous love had been carefully packed away behind the armor of expensive fabric. But when he looked up and saw me in the doorway, something in his expression softened. Just slightly. Just enough. "Cynthia, come in." I stepped inside, acutely aware of how out of place I looked in his world, even wearing clothes he'd provided. The study was all dark wood and leather, walls lined with books in languages I couldn't read, and art that probably belonged in museums. A fire burned in another fireplace, because apparently every room in this mansion required its own source of warmth. "How did you sleep?" He closed the laptop, giving me his full attention. "Better than I have in years." The honesty surprised me, but lying seemed pointless. "The bed is comfortable, I hope." A slight smile touched his lips. "I had it replaced last week. The previous one was too firm." He'd replaced the bed. In a guest room I'd never seen. In a house I'd never visited. Because he'd been preparing for this.
For me.
"Steve, I need to know something." I moved closer to the desk but didn't sit. "Last night you said I could leave if I wanted. Was that true?" The smile faded. Yes. So, I'm not a prisoner here. You're under my protection. There's a difference. Is there? I gestured at the windows, at the manicured grounds visible beyond them, at the iron gates I knew stood between me and the world outside. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like another cage. Beautiful, yes. Safe, absolutely. But still a cage. He stood, moving around the desk with that controlled grace that made even the limp seem deliberate. When he reached me, he stopped just close enough to make me aware of his presence without crowding. A cage implies you're being held against your will. His voice was quiet, measured. I told you last night, if you want to leave, I'll arrange it. A new apartment in another city, another identity if necessary, enough money that you'll never have to work unless you want to. I'll make sure you're safe even if you're not here. And you just let me go? After everything you've done to keep me close. I'd hate it. The admission was raw, unguarded. I'd spend every day wondering if you were safe, if the protection I'd arranged was enough, if I'd made a mistake letting you walk away. But yes, I'd let you go. Because keeping you here by force would make me exactly what I killed yesterday. A man who uses power to control what he can't earn. I studied his face, looking for the lie, the manipulation, the angle. But all I saw was truth, painful and absolute. What if? I stopped, uncertain how to phrase the question that had been building since I woke up. What if I don't want to leave? Something flickered in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear that he'd misheard. Then you stay. Just like that? Just like that. He reached up slowly, giving me time to pull away, and traced the edge of my jaw with one finger, careful of the bruising. But you need to understand what staying means, Cynthia. This isn't temporary protection until the threat passes. If you stay, you become part of this world. My world. The one where problems are solved with violence, where loyalty is currency, where the rules you've lived by your entire life don't apply. I know, and I did. I'd seen enough in the last 24 hours to understand exactly what I'd be choosing. I've spent 12 years running, Steve. Building walls, staying distant, convincing myself that if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, I could outrun my past. But it didn't work. Ray found me anyway. The fear followed me anyway. And now he's gone. Because of you. I looked up at him, at the man who'd killed for me without hesitation, who'd loved me from the shadows for over a decade, who'd built this beautiful cage, and then offered me the key. You did what the law couldn't. What I couldn't. You made me safe in a way I've never been safe before. His hand moved from my jaw to cup my face, his thumb brushing across my cheek. Safety isn't the same as freedom. Maybe not. But freedom doesn't mean much when you're constantly looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next attack. I placed my hand over his, holding it against my face. I'm tired of running, Steve. Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending I don't need anyone. What are you saying? I'm saying the cage you've built, this mansion, these walls, your protection, it's not a cage to me anymore. The words felt like a confession, like admitting to a crime I hadn't known I was committing. It's the first place I've felt safe since my mother died. The first place where I don't have to be strong every second of every day because someone else is watching the shadows. He pulled me closer, gentle despite the strength I could feel coiled beneath his careful control. You don't have to decide right now.
Take time.
Adjust. Make sure this is really what you want. I've had 12 years to decide. I leaned into him, ignoring the protest from my bruised ribs. I choose this. I choose you. Not because you've forced me or manipulated me or left me no other option, but because for the first time in my life, I'm choosing to stop running and trust someone to keep me safe. His arms came around me, careful of my injuries, holding me with a tenderness that seemed impossible from hands that had ordered death just yesterday. You understand what you're accepting? Who I am. What I've done. You're a monster. I said it clearly, without judgment. But you're my monster. And maybe that's enough. He pressed his lips to the top of my head, and I felt him exhale against my hair, releasing tension I hadn't realized he'd been holding. I'll never let anyone hurt you again. I know. And I did. Standing there in his study, wrapped in the arms of a man who'd killed for me and would kill again, I finally understood the difference between a cage and a sanctuary. A cage was built to keep you prisoner. A sanctuary was built to keep the monsters out. I'd just chosen to live with the one monster who promised to defend me against all the others. Through the window, I could see the iron gates standing guard at the end of the drive. Not a barrier keeping me in, I realized now, but a wall keeping the world out. The gilded cage had become my fortress. And I was done running.